The following episode of Bread for the People is brought to you by Side Hustle Bread, Long Island's handcrafted artisanal bread company. Side Hustle Bread is a family-run virtual bakery that's bringing the neighborhood feel back to Long Island, one loaf at a time. Head on over to sidehustlebread.com for more information, upcoming appearances, and merchandise. My name's Jim Serpico, and this... Should I start with my name, or should I start with This Is Bread for the People? Do you like it like this? Welcome to Bread. Or do you like it like this? Welcome. Ready? Welcome to Bread for the People. Mine... Is there a script? Welcome to Bread for the People. I'm Jim Serpico. Today's guest is a market researcher, a market consultant, and a content strategist. He's the creator of the blog Leblanguage. Please welcome my friend, Steve Leblang. How are you?
Some people would be shocked to hear I'm doing great.
Some people would be shocked. Some people would be upset to hear you're doing great. Is that really what you mean?
There's probably a few who would be upset to hear that news, but they probably wouldn't be smart enough to be listening to something as classy as this.
There you go. Steve, let's give some people some context and explain. When we worked together, you were an analyst at Sony. Can you describe what your expertise was and what your role... I'm sorry, it was actually at FX Network. Could you describe what your role was at FX Network?
Basically, I was the consigliere. I used to describe our little environment at the time. It was the era of the West Wing. And I described myself as like being like John Spencer's role on the show. So I was the guy who would give the president the emis, and then he'd have to turn around and figure out how to lead the troops in. What I always tried to do, unlike a lot of people in my position, is that I tried to be sensitive to creators, because I've kind of had a creative side to myself. I've always, one of the reasons I went to Hollywood from LA is I did not want to be in ad sales. I did not want to be in news. I wanted to be in, on the studio lots and, where the action was.
Right. So what people might not realize is that, every network and every studio has, this is a job you could get, right? You could study for it. You could go to school for it. You could get an internship in it. This is a job.
You can learn these things in school. And I would say the position now has evolved into more of an analytics role, where people, who have good skills in mining data are able to get that kind of training where presentation is emphasized. But I approached it more of an interpretation of information. In other words, getting the what is relatively easy to do. And it's a lot easier now because everything is automated. There's a tremendous amount of data that's at one's disposal. But it's, what does this data say? Why is this data meaningful? And that's what, that skill set is really more something that comes out of experience than anything else.
Okay. Before we dive into why it is meaningful, let's dive right into some action. Okay? Let's dive into a show we did together, so we could give some context to the job. We did a series called Rescue Me at FX Network.
Yes, we did.
And you have to shoot a pilot. Usually, in 99% of the cases, you shoot a pilot where the networks and the studios spend several $1 million to do a test episode, and that episode may or may not air. That episode is shipped out to Vegas, or they have these places in Los Angeles.
I actually was a proponent of taking it out of these places. So one of the things we did with Rescue...
You were?
Yes, I was.
Wait, before we do that, let's when people just explain these places, because I've been there and it's crazy, man. I've been there several times on several different shows that I've produced on pilots, and for me, as the executive producer of these things, there is so much at stake, because if it doesn't test well, you are usually finished. And I'm sitting behind a two-way mirror, and it's the scariest thing for a producer.
Because you're about to find out if people think your baby is ugly or if your baby is actually worthy of being entered into the competition.
So you were a proponent of taking him out of the town? You wanted to leave?
So one of the things that we would do with FX, because FX was a network that was kind of on the upswing at the time, we were as much concerned with where the perception of the network was, if anybody had actually heard of it. When FX first started out, people thought it was the Brian Brown movie, or we were referring to something, with special effects. Later on, people said, "Oh, it's Fox," and they mistyped it. But as FX developed an identity, developed a personality, it became kind of the home of the anti-hero. And it became the home of, we used the line, Brandon Tartikoff, who was one of the most brilliant programmers ever was, he described Miami Vice as MTV Cops. And so we described FX as HBO for free. And we wanted to come out with shows that advertisers would be willing to buy time in the same way that if they could have bought it in The Sopranos at the time, they would have done that. So we looked for people and concepts that were as groundbreaking as The Sopranos, which featured what I believe is one of the best anti-heroes of all time, and had that sort of quality. And that was the threshold that we used for Dennis's character, Tommy Gavin.
Right. Dennis Leary's Tommy Gavin, a show I was one of 3 executive producers on. So we shot that pilot, and we turned it into you guys. I, at that point, hadn't had many conversations with you at all. I was doing my conversations with Eric Schreier, maybe Nick Rad. I think the pilot was under the reign of
Kevin. Kevin did the pilot, and then John came in when we were about to go to series.
And Kevin Riley, one of the big network executives, still working in Hollywood today. He's run many big networks from NBC to TBS, and he's a legend. We give you the pilot, and then you figure out, all right, we got to test this. We do what we always do, and the point of the test isn't just to put it on or kill it. Right? Sometimes it's to come up with things that nobody would have ever thought about, to maybe improve it. Even if they know it's going to air.
Let me let you in a little secret. Unless this thing had really tanked, FX was really wanting to be in business with somebody who had the profile that Dennis did. And particularly because Dennis was making a bend in his career and going from, pure comedy and being a smartass to a more dramatic role. And what we did a pilot for was to kind of work out the kinks, to kind of see what resonated and what didn't. Now, what upset us was we did the pilot in Boston. We tested it in Boston because it was set, in New York, but it was set around, a guy who had, strong popularity in Boston and Massachusetts. And then we did the other test in, I believe, Phoenix, Arizona. And we did that because not only did we want to have something that counterbalanced Boston in so many ways, but we did not do it in New York because we felt that it was still 9/11, which was the theme of Rescue Me, was still too fresh in people's minds that they would be potentially offended if they saw something that was taking a dramatic license over something that was so tragic. And Los Angeles, we felt, had some issues as well. So that was where we took this show. The show did not.
Now, we were not invited. We were not invited to attend the test sessions like sometimes you are. I'm not sure. Does that why are sometimes people, creators and producers, invited to see it and sometimes they're not?
Executives sometimes want to be protective because they have their own agenda, and I think they sometimes want leverage against producers. Because look, we're a business that's driven by talent. Okay. Executives can make a tremendous amount of money, but they rarely get the spotlight. I'd say we were among the exceptions in that category. So by having some control over the testing, they have some control of the narrative. And by having control of the narrative, that gives them the leverage to be able to say to you, do this or else. I think one of the reasons that we got so friendly is, you have some experience with people in research, and you knew that, you weren't necessarily getting the complete story. I had this experience with several producers. They kind of get the song and dance from the programming executives. They get their take. If they were being nice, they go, "Oh, we just think this is a missed opportunity." But, we sit down and say, look, people want to like this show. They like Dennis. In this particular case, what they did not like was the way the pilot ended. And we isolated it. We did it both with graphs, because every show that you test has a real-time graph. It's called a trace, a dial trace. And you can see it almost like an EKG. And you can see the progress go second to second, minute to minute, right?
I hate it. I mean, I've sat in so many of these test sessions where you're watching that trace and EKG in real time. And it's also so surprising, like in comedies especially, and in drama, some of the emotional elements.
What a lot of people don't realize, what a lot of creatives don't realize, is that there are norms and there are patterns and there are paces. So if you get a trace of a dial that starts at, we always start a dial at 50. So basically you're neutral. And then we kind of see it as like, if you're a baseball fan, look at it as like a war score, or a what do they call it? A wins, the rap score. Okay, it's how much better you are than the norm. We know that there are going to be certain scenes that are going to peak, certain valleys that you're going to see when you come out of the scene. Dials are going to reset. Producers don't necessarily know this. They want to keep seeing it climb and climb and climb. Almost never will the show do that. But it's what.
And by the way, sometimes it's a really good thing when you're setting up a real comedic moment. Like, you kind of want it to fall to help set up what's about to come. And then, man, if it peaks on that laugh, you got something.
One of the things that we would love about Rescue Me is that you had a cast that was very much attuned to comedy as well as drama. In fact, when we had that strike, we actually did little Rescue Me comedy vignettes. We had a Rescue Me comedy tour.
That's right. We did it at Radio City Music Hall.
Exactly. Remember? And it was a charity thing for firefighters. Yeah. So you'd have 1 minute where there'd be this emotional scene where Dennis's character was like in the middle of a meltdown, thinking, he was always tortured by the memory of his dead cousin who died in 9/11. That was a big plot line. So he's this tortured soul. He's this guy who's got, survivor's remorse. And then the next minute he'd be teasing one of the guys about, oh, this is Black Sean, and he's not the other Sean. Oh, this one's got ass cancer. He wouldn't be smoking the cigarettes, but you'd hear everything on him. Anyway, but we had those comic moments, and then they'd be, intertwined with those really dramatic turns.
Right. So we've identified that the audiences who were watching the tests were not so happy with the ending. And then, as per usual, the executives don't always. I mean, listen, the executives at FX are some of the best there are. I have nothing but amazing things to say about all of them, and I love them. But executives speak sometimes, and I'm not saying it in this case even, but it's not always so straightforward. So you kind of got to read between the lines.
No. Like I said, a lot of executives come in with their own agendas, and and oftentimes it's tied to like leverage and negotiations. It's can we get them not only to be in our control, but ultimately can we get them a little cheaper? And can we get a better deal out of it? So, you know, many people who would do what I do are kind of mouthpieces. You know, I would say that in the time, particularly when, you know, the Ligoris of the world were around, he wanted that honesty, but he wanted it couched in a way where we weren't necessarily playing our hand. So he would bring me in.
Right. So that was you're talking about Peter Ligori, who was the president of FX when we sold the show, but then moved over to Big Fox.
Exactly. And then the guy who replaced Kevin Riley, John Landgraf, who's still at FX, came in around that time. And look, John has very strong opinions about things that he gets passionate about. This was a project that he inherited. And I would say one of the things that he observed when, he looked at the data is said, I'm not crazy about the way that this show's arc is progressing. And here's the evidence to prove that I'm right.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of creators, though, get defensive, just like writers, I think, and don't want to believe that these tests are accurate.
Yeah. What I would always tell, like, a commercial artist is, do you want to make paintings that will sell, or do you want to forever live in a cold water flat where you're, surrounded by your own paint? And, there's nothing that's as, self-serving as a starving artist. And I don't think people want to starve. I think people want success. So I would basically say, they say, what do you think? It's like, okay, what I think will all go broke. But if I'm doing my job correctly, I'm giving you the best ability to get a window into what others are thinking, your target audience, FX viewers, aspirational FX viewers, people that liked shows about first responders. That's who we brought in to see Rescue Me. We knew that somebody.
Now, all this being said, there have been shows that have not tested well, that have gone on to be giant hits, and Seinfeld being one of them, right? So how does an artist decide whether or not they have to trust their gut or be open-minded enough to at least hear the information and then maybe sit on it for a while?
I'll give your listeners a little secret about Seinfeld. And in fact, the guy who ran Castle Rock, Glenn Padnick, would always have the testing results of Seinfeld framed on his wall. And it said it was mediocre, that they did not like the, originally Elaine was not in the pilot, and Elaine got written in later on. They said that it was a little too male, a little too New York. But what that verdict was, it came from 50 people in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. And it came from people who liked the kind of NBC sitcoms that were on at the time. They liked Cheers. They liked Family Ties. They liked Cosby. That's ultimately where the show got its, foundation. But it was nothing like those shows. And one of the things that you have to prepare for in good market research is to be prepared for the unusual. And if something is out of the box, and if something gets your attention, that's good, because you want to stand out, particularly on a network like FX that still people did not know what channel it was, what position on the cable system it was, or frankly, had they even heard of it. A lot of people knew Dennis from his MTV days, from the ABC show that you guys did, or Peter did with him. But that's what FX wanted, is to tap into somebody who could bring that in. When we did a show a few years previously with Howard Stern as executive producer. We did that specifically because Howard got the show on the air in New York City, the network on the air in New York City. It was an embarrassing show. It was lousy, but it got.
What was that? Son of the Beach.
Son of the Beach, exactly, with Tim Stack. Yep, and it did pretty good ratings. It actually.
He never went back into television producing after.
Correct. He didn't have to, because at that time, then Sirius, made him a billionaire. So he don't need that. But so what we would do, because we didn't have a lot of Fox loved to work on the quarter system. Fox would give us a quarter of the budget and a quarter of the staff of their competitors. So I'd wind up doing the qualitative and the quantitative. I'd get on planes, and I'd sometimes be in 2-3 cities a week. And my goal was to make sure that we were talking to the right people in the right place in the right way. Because if you don't have all three of those components, you're going to get a lot of misinformation. Going back to Seinfeld, there was a lot of misinformation. But at that point, Warren Littlefield said, you know what? There's some concern here. So let's hedge our bets. Let's do this with not a dime from Primetime's budget. We're going to do it with the late night budget. We'll do 4 half hours for the price of a 2-hour movie or special. And we'll air it in July. That was the first season of Seinfeld. Seinfeld Chronicles. 4 episodes, well, actually 4 episodes was the pilot, 5 weeks in July of August of 1990. Did decently. They did another 13 mid-season of 91.
But at that point now, already on the next 13, they made changes.
Yes, they did.
Based on the first 5.
Right. Elaine
was introduced.
Elaine became when the show first started out, they couldn't figure out if Jerry and Elaine were boyfriend and girlfriend, or or if they were broken up. So they finally, in that second batch of the 13, they had the whole thing where they try to negotiate themselves in the bedroom, and they ultimately decided that they can only be friends. And by doing that, they freed up her character to date losers, for Jerry to date a lot, and for both of them to come out as more narcissistic. And then they were hilariously more similar to people like George and Kramer, who were the end of the spectrums, both in terms of narcissism and in weirdness.
The other change that I just read about this week, I think it was in a Mark Hirschfeld article, who's an amazing casting director and was the casting director at NBC during Seinfeld, or it was Jason Alexander talking about it. He didn't realize in those first 5 episodes that his character was actually based on Larry David. He was channeling Woody Allen, which is what he brought to the original character. And when that became unlocked, his character really took off.
Well, and then Larry was more directly involved. Larry kind of saw this as, I'll do a couple of these, and maybe I'll move on to something else. But once he saw that there was a real opportunity here, he basically based George on himself and made him more of what we see in Curb. And frankly, Curb has proven that Larry Unfiltered is even longer. I mean, Seinfeld went 9 seasons. Curb is going to go into its 12th.
Yeah, both amazing shows. I mean,
yes, indeed,
absolutely amazing. He's a trailblazer. Whether he knew at the time he was or not, he just did his thing.
Hey, Sony. The single biggest reason that Sony is still in existence is because of Seinfeld.
Absolutely. All right, let's get back to the Rescue Me pilot. So the news is delivered. What's your recollection of how it was received by our creative team?
what I remember, I wasn't in too many meetings with Dennis, but and I knew that Dennis was a bit of a hothead. I knew he had had a real bad experience with people at ABC on the job, and they basically told him nobody's going to believe a cop can be crooked. This was before the Shield, by the way. And so we knew that he got a raw deal at ABC. So what we were disappointed by was the fact that in the pilot, as I recall, the last scene, now Tommy was playing a recovering alcoholic. And, certainly an experience like 9/11 could get you to relapse. What we saw at the end of the pilot was a de-evolution of his character, where he regresses. He basically goes out on a drinking binge, screws his way because he breaks up with his wife, and it seems like it's for good. So he goes out, goes to clubs, screws his way through scenes. It's very revealing, and basically you're seeing him being narcissistic, and then he throws his recovery chip into the ocean, throws his sobriety away. And you see this with the backdrop of the smoldering Twin Towers. I think the Staten Island was shot, if I'm not mistaken. So we said, people want to see redemption. Because if you're an anti-hero, you want to have something redeeming about you. When you see a Tony Soprano being a loving father, when you see Michael Chiklis trying to be a vigilante in the Shield, those anti-heroes play very well. It's the first episode. You've got to establish that Tommy Gavin's a good guy, and that he's also good to himself. And I'll let you take over as to what you decided to do.
After many conversations, I believe it came down to Landgraf, Dennis, and Peter talking about alternate endings. And I remember there was a whole boatload of money put up for us to reshoot the end, and that was a big deal. And at that point, we knew we had to do it. We knew how important it was to the network, and
we ordered the show to series contingent on this reshoot being the first thing that was shot.
And I don't know, it might have been John Landgraf's pitch for Tommy to be ultimately walking away on the sand.
I believe you're
right. And
those
footprints disappear. And it became an iconic ending. It was just a brilliant ending to what was ultimately the pilot that aired. And it did show the redemption of the character, and I think everybody was thrilled with it. And to be honest, it's like there was a love affair between the creators and John Landgraf. They trusted him. He had really good creative ideas. They've credited him with that, and the show went on to be a giant success.
93 episodes, 7 seasons. And what's interesting is that in this day and age, a streaming show almost never gets to that total because the economics are simply just no longer there. A successful streaming series will be lucky if it makes it through 4 seasons. Because usually there's escalators.
We were at the end of that. The traditional thing, including Sopranos. Sopranos was the one that I think killed it all for everyone, in my opinion. And that this is me just sitting back, being involved in the television business, but I don't know for sure. But they made this syndication deal with A&E Networks for a ton of money, and when it repeated on A&E, it didn't do very well.
Do you know why?
No. Maybe branding. It didn't fit in with what the network was doing is my guess,
Nothing to do
but
with
I'm
that.
not sure.
Because Sex and the City had the same problem. These shows were out on DVD. Even though they didn't count in ratings, people who didn't subscribe to HBO, and interestingly enough, HBO only reached about 1/3 of the country. So one of the reasons that we said free HBO is not only that we would be able to sell advertisers in it, but FX was in about 2/3 of the country ultimately. So because it's basic cable. So we were able to make these shows, these high quality shows, available to more people who had the ability to be measured by Nielsen. What it didn't take into account was home video. So people saw the unedited shows. They knew when a character would say the F word. They knew scenes in Sex and the City where there's more explicit sex. For cable syndication, broadcast syndication, in the case of Sex and the City, those scenes had to be overdubbed or deleted. You were getting homogenized television.
Aha. So it was rejected by the audiences.
Right, because it was dishonest. It lost. They go to their friends and they'd say, "Did you see this scene where she said, 'Oh fudge'?" And they said, "What are you talking about? It's 'oh fuck.'" That was why that happened. What happened ultimately, though, was these shows lost the ability to make a back end. And now what's happening in the streaming world is that all of these studios that are operating what we call walled gardens, the Paramount Plus, the Peacock, the HBO Max, the Disney Plus, Hulu, all of these studios are operating as walled gardens, and they're keeping all this content for themselves. But there's only a certain
back
amount.
end for our listeners. Our listeners may not know what back end is, but there were two revenue streams when you produce a series traditionally, and there still are in network and some, but back end was where, if you got to the point where you got back end, that's where they back up the Brinks truck to your house and you are set for life. They pay you X amount of money to air it on the first run on those networks, and then the studio or whoever owns the copyright would sell it somewhere else. And because it was already a proven success, those other networks that would buy it, sometimes indefinitely, would pay through the nose for those episodes. And that's how people became multi-millionaires, by making back end. It didn't happen that often, but when a show was successful and your show went into syndication and you got back end, you were set for life.
You were set for life, exactly. But now what happens is that ecosystem is gone. So that a creator has to adjust to the reality that you're going to be able to tell a limited story, and that you're going to have to be prolific with what you do, because you're probably going to be able to tell a story for about 30 to 40 episodes. And you're probably going to be paid a little more than you would typically paid on what we call the front end. But you're not necessarily going to have the chance at the back end. Now that is starting to change. Warner Brothers Discovery is looking now to license some of their content to non-Warner Brothers Discovery platforms and networks. So there might be a syndication model there. But, I for one...
But I can't see it. Even if it happened, it can't be that lucrative compared to what it was.
It won't be, because there's been there's audience fragmentation now two ways. One is that there's simply more different things to watch on more different platforms. Nielsen no longer measures every screen. So your kid's watching on a tablet something, or they're watching on their phone. Nielsen does not measure that. So depending upon the show and the platform and the age of the show, or the age of the audience of the show, there could be as much as 30 to 50, sometimes 50% of what we call total consumption that's occurring in ecosystems that Nielsen can't measure. So what do? You make assumptions of what the value is. You believe that subscriptions are going to keep people in bay because subscriptions are constant. Okay, in order to be able to watch on whatever device you have to have access to it on your phone. You have to have access to it. So it's what will keep somebody from not subscribing to something. And usually it's, do we have enough different things often and changing out often enough to do it? So if you keep doing this, and then you bake in the fact that once a show hits a fourth season, there's usually escalators to pay, people, higher rates per show. Rarely is the incentive there to take a show beyond 30, 40 episodes.
Yeah. Times have definitely changed. But relatively speaking, it still pays pretty well, right?
Oh, listen, let me put it this way. If your listeners knew how much an executive producer gets, how much a top tier talent gets, I think they'd say that there's an awful lot of bread besides the ones that you're baking
there. Let's leave it at that. So I want to cover a couple things, couple other stories before we wrap things up. Another example of how your role impacted or impacts television shows could be something as simple, not that it's simple, I don't mean to minimize it, but the title of a show is very important. Also, what about the advertising campaigns? You mentioned being outside the box. For a long time, FX's slogan was "There is no box," which I thought was amazing. Did part of that come out of testing?
So one of the things that we would do, like I said, we had a very limited budget, and we would, travel around to get a flavor for what the perception of the network is. We'd always bake in 5 or 10 extra minutes to every test session to kind of look at, potential ad campaigns, potential, if we were going to release something on home video, boxes, things like that. And what we'd be able to do is get a flavor for what resonated with people, what color scheme, what thematic. We had, I did a blog recently where I had 3 or 4 different images from 3 or 4 different seasons of Rescue Me, and there's one that Dennis is more serious. There's another one where he's he's just come out of the burning building. And there's another one where he's literally naked and he's going like this. And that's the one that Hulu, of all things, has been using for their imagery. Because, he's just angry. So it's that's almost a dog whistle to what the theme of the season is going to be. In this arc, Tommy is more serious. He's more challenged. In this one, he goes totally off the rails. And if you look at the key, we call that key art. And when you see the key art, it kind of gives you an appetite for what you're going to see, and then hopefully a desire to keep coming back.
What about The Shield? Do you have?
Well, The Shield was a perfect example of the title change. That's right. Shield was going to be called, at first, the pilot was called The Barn. And they actually referred to the precinct where it took place as The Barn, because it looked like a barn. It's a rundown neighborhood in LA. Then the guy who's now the chairman of Comcast, who'd grown up in LA, said, this is all based upon, the whole Rampart incident with all the dirty cops. And we said, what's called the show Rampart? And we threw out those 2 titles. First of all, when you said The Barn, they thought they were going to get Green Acres. When you said Rampart, they had no idea what it was. Maybe they knew it from the Star Spangled Banner. And we're looking, and I'll never forget, one older person at the time, this is like 2001, said, it's kind of like somebody shot a hole through Sergeant Friday on Dragnet. And if people who might not remember, Dragnet used this iconic symbol of like the badge. The story you're about to see is true. The name's been changed to protect the innocent. So one of the mock-ups that we had was a bullet-ridden badge. And like, and then we said, and then somebody referred to it as the shield as opposed to the badge, because it kind of looked like a shield. So we came up with these three things, and we just basically, we have to lobby with, the chairman, because he was Peter's boss. And we said, you know what? This show is going to be so groundbreaking and so different, because what show has the main character shoot his partner in the head at the end of the first episode? So we said, you know what? It's going to be so difficult for people to see this as a cop show. Let's make it simple on them and let them know it is a cop show. If you say the shield and you show a badge, it's a show about a cop. We're not saying what kind of a cop, but that was the phrase we used. The good cop and the bad cop went home for the evening. I'm a different kind of cop.
Listen, simple is usually better. That's really in any business, in any marketing campaign.
It's very difficult to sell a new concept. It's very difficult to sell a new title. That's why movies and streaming services are doing so many franchises and so many reboots. I just saw Steve Leblang.
Yeah, but I hate that.
Well, but
I hate it.
But you know what, though?
It's like a cheat, and it's like as an artist, there's nothing new. It's like, come on, guys. There's a whole new generation of people out there trying to create stuff. Then it's being compared to the new thing. I don't know. It's just not for me.
Well, I'll tell you. To me, there's two kinds of reboots. There's bringing you up to speed with characters you once knew at a different stage of life. That, to me, is a reboot. So, for example, what you saw with
Sex and the City.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And just like that, exactly. So you're seeing these characters.
I'm into that.
Okay.
I guess you could say The Godfather was a reboot in reverse, and that's okay as long as the quality is there and people. You could tell when people are just doing it for the money, and a lot of these reboots.
Well, sequels
aren't as good, or
I mean, tell me, Top Gun was a reboot, for God's sake. And that made $1 billion.
True, and I haven't seen it, but I heard it was amazing.
Oh, it's pretty damn good. I mean, I made a particular effort to get out after being in lockdown, so it was definitely worth it. But it's very difficult to sell in something new. So studios will do these cheats almost by necessity. So I had the privilege of working with Norman Lear on a new version of One Day at a Time. And I actually got to teach Norman Lear the way we do market research, which is to do these dials, but to do them all over the country and to do them with highly segmented audiences. Not the way that Seinfeld did. Not the way that All in the Family had 3 pilots. 2 with ABC, 1 with NBC. Each one of them had 2 different actors as the children, as Mike and Gloria. And they finally, in the 3rd one, found Rob and Sally, and that was the one that sold. But, Norman reimagined One Day at a Time. He had a meeting with a woman named Gloria Calderon-Kellett, and he said, what is it like for you to be a singer? And she was raised by a woman who's very similar to Rita Moreno's character on the show. And he said, what was it like for you to be raised by a single mother as a Latina? Because she was raised around the same time that the original show was on. And she said, we drew from Anne Morano's character because the struggle you have to reach children is similar regardless of the culture. But in a Latino culture, it takes on an entirely different dynamic. And he said, okay, so you're going to be my partner in this. I'll give you the title. I'll give you the framework. You know, we had a completely different Schneider. We had a completely different Alex. We had, you know, different elements, challenges that Anne never had. You know, in the Netflix series, the daughter comes out as gay around her quinceañera. And, you know, it's a reality. You know, kids today have that. And introducing it at the time of Trump, you know, the first presidency, plus, you know, with DACA and all these other things, it was the perfect Norman Lear formula. It made you laugh, it made you cry, and it made you think. But it was, the title was the same, the characters were, some of the names of the characters were the same, but the show was different. It was a reimagining.
That I like and I love. And listen, it's Norman Lear. And I've said it before on this podcast because I've had your friend Bob Oswax on. Norman Lear is, the best writer ever in television and continues to be. We're going to have to wrap this up. I feel like I could talk to you all day. I want to cover one more thing. I want to wrap this up with a new segment I have, Steve. 5 questions I'm going to ask you about bread.
This is your version of the Colbert questionnaire.
This is the questionnaire. Okay?
Okay, go for it.
You're going to answer these as short as possible. 1 word if possible. What's your favorite type of bread?
Cinnamon raisin.
Which meal does bread pair best with? Breakfast, lunch, or dinner?
I am a breakfast guy.
You're a breakfast guy?
Get the carbs out of the way as early as possible.
There you go. Then you could walk them off. Would you rather bake your own bread, buy it from a bakery, or eat it in a restaurant?
I do a lot of cooking, but I've never tried bread. And I know that it's a science. At this point, I'd feel safer about buying it in a bakery because it's cheaper, but I would love to learn how to properly bake bread. And then have enough people around to finish it off.
All right. Maybe me, you, and Bob Oswax will get together and we'll do that. Last question. Which one of my bread would you like me to send you in the mail? My prosciutto bread, my cheddar jalapeno sourdough, or my plain-ass Italian bread?
I would not be alive today if it were not for an incredibly beautiful Italian person. I've always loved Italian bread, but the prosciutto bread sounds absolutely incredible. And I need to try something new because every day that I get to live beyond what I almost experienced is a day that I want to experience something new. So unless you're willing to send me two loaves, I'll take the prosciutto.
You got it. Steve, thanks for being my guest today. I feel like I could talk to you forever. Maybe we'll do this again. I appreciate you coming on, man. This episode was produced by Miles. This episode was edited by Brock Higley. His real name, you know that? He's going to edit it. Are you going to hear this? I love that. He sounds like an action star or something. If you have an idea for an episode or a bread-adjacent story, send me an email at breadforthepeoplepod@gmail.com.